I'd like to share with you something that happened to me many years ago, yet it remains etched in my memory as one of the strangest periods of my life. Everything began in the house where I still live with my mother. It was just an ordinary house, located in the Colonia Las Grañas, in the city of Chihuahua. Behind it, there's a backyard, a place I remember as my parents' pride and joy when we first moved in. They dedicated endless hours of care, shaping it into a garden that looked almost like something out of an exhibition. But as time went on, my father's work became more demanding, and my mother started working too. Slowly, the garden lost its charm and fell into neglect. The once cared for trees grew wild, and at certain times of the year, the place took on a gloomy, almost sinister look, as if it could serve as a backdrop for a horror film. As a child, I never thought much about it, nor did my family. But when younger cousins came to visit, I noticed how they refused to play outside once the sun went down. That was when I realized the garden had a different kind of presence. For me, though, everything seemed normal. That yard was part of my childhood, a space where I spent countless hours with my parents, helping out and making memories. But I remember clearly the first time I felt something was off. It was during Holy Week vacation, back in my middle school days. I had stayed up late playing video games until about 2 in the morning, when exhaustion finally forced me to bed. Just as I was about to sleep, the loud cries of fighting or mating cats echoed outside. It was an awful sound that always made me uncomfortable. I heard them racing across the roof. Annoyed, I opened the window and shouted, trying to scare them off. But they only seemed to make more noise, running back and forth, determined to disturb me. I went to the bathroom to brush my teeth when suddenly, there was a loud thud on the roof as if something heavy had fallen onto it. And then, silence. The cats vanished instantly. For a brief moment, I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing serious. But the silence that followed had a weight to it, something unsettling. As I lay in bed, I began to hear and almost feel through the walls something moving above me. Something dragging itself, like footsteps trying carefully not to be heard. The sound crept closer, reaching the edge of the roof right outside my window. I was torn between sleep and fear, unsure if it was real or just a dream. I even imagined myself getting up to wake my parents. But in an instant, it all blurred, and I drifted off again. Later that night, I was jolted awake by a noise, something heavy landing in the backyard. Alarmed, I peeked through the window. Between the branches, I could make out a figure, walking through the garden. My first thought was, a thief. I grabbed a flashlight from my desk, opened the window noisily, and shone the beam toward the figure. But by the time the light reached the garden, it was gone. I ran to wake my parents. My father grabbed an old shotgun that had once belonged to my grandfather, and together we went outside to check. After a tense search, we found nothing. My father suggested whoever it was must have fled, though deep down, I knew he believed I had imagined it all. But from that night on, the strange noises continued. They came from the backyard, right outside my window. Often, I'd find myself peering through the blinds, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Sometimes, I was sure I saw something shift between the trees, but I never woke my parents again. Meanwhile, my mother had her own encounters. She wasn't in the best place with my father at the time, and often chose to sleep in a downstairs room, a dim, seldom used space where I once slept as a child. That room had a large window, always covered by thick trees and bougainvillea vines outside. One night, she told me, she saw a man staring at her through that window. His face pale, almost skeletal, ghostly. The sight terrified her so much she abandoned her pride, rushed upstairs, and slept next to my father again. She was convinced it wasn't a thief. She believed it was something else, something we couldn't fight with my grandfather's shotgun. In her deep Catholic faith, she interpreted it as a demon, a punishment for considering divorce, for daring to question her sacred vows. I didn't know what it was, but I too saw him. A man, standing in the yard. Smiling. Watching us from between the trees, almost mocking us as if to say we were only imagining him. Months later, during a family celebration for one of my cousins, something chilling happened again. My little cousin Camila, only about 4 years old at the time, had been running endlessly between the front and back yards, full of energy. Then, suddenly, silence. We realized she had disappeared into the backyard. A scream pierced the night, and we all rushed out. My aunt found her in the darkness and carried her inside, trembling. Between sobs, Camila said a man had been playing with her in the backyard. He told her to run back and forth between the front and backyards. But then, he told her to come closer, into the trees. He grabbed her by the arm, pulled her toward him, and leaned in with that same smiling face. That's when she screamed. There were no marks on her, so the adults dismissed it as imagination. But later that night, when the house was quiet, I finally confessed to my mother everything I had seen. She, in turn, shared her own story with me. Not long after, my parents divorced. And strangely enough, from that moment on, the man from the garden never returned. At least, I haven't seen or heard him since. Life has been quieter without my father around, in more ways than one. He and I were never very close, and now we hardly talk. Yet, sometimes I wonder, did he ever notice it too? That figure who lived in our garden.